I would pass, but I changed my mind. I just wanted to say one thing, which maybe I don't know whether it's something that other people feel, and maybe it depends upon the kind of project you'll be doing. But I have a lot of problem with the psychological prosthetics project, and I've can toy with it, and we abandon it and kind of start it up again and keep going. And then, of course, you have an engagement where it really feels valuable and worthwhile, and then it feels incredibly superficial. And I wanted to kind of juxtapose that with a project that Nomi Talisman, who's in the audience too, actually just there in a wave at this point, she's bending over. So that Nomi and I are working on, which is actually working with the families of people who are prisoners on death row. And just to kind of juxtapose those two things for myself, because there's a real complexity for me in trying to address issues that have sort of this. Both issues for me are really significant issues in terms of corporate kind of perceptions of perfect happiness and how that becomes marketed, and on the other hand incarcerating people who are going to die at the hands of the government. But how you handle those two relationships, does one become an incredibly utopian ideological project where it becomes bleeding heart, and the other becomes a kind of like a glib kind of hip funny kind of thing. And I have some kind of like personal concerns about that, and I don't know how to handle that. And so I'm trying to kind of work with both in order to explore those issues that, for me, are both of them are very serious, and yet I'm trying different kind of mechanisms for exploring them. The second is going to be documentary, which will be animated with some of the families of the kids of the families to kind of talk about the experience of those people. So I just thought it was kind of throw that in because it's something I feel kind of torn about.
So I'd like to follow up with another question that has to do with performance personas. And I'd like to ask first if people want to follow up on this question of utopia and the public before we go on. Okay. And this has to do with the fact that everyone here works with communities, different communities over time. And I'd like to ask a couple of questions that have both to do with the formal performance that you two embody a little bit more than the others on the panel, and then the question of how you perform as a subject, engaging others in a community, and how you actually have to adopt certain kind of persona as an artist or as a whatever it is you want to define it as, and the complexity of taking on that role. And so my question has to do with degrees of verisimilitude. In other words, with the two of you, you are clearly in the Yes Men trying to pass, right? You need to pass enough and have enough of the right suit, look, etc., that you can get past the door and up onto the stage. In your case, you're sort of halfway between a pharmaceutical employee and artist, insofar as you're not going so far as to get the hairdo and do all of the, I mean, literally, like to do this, a certain kind of formal engagement with that persona that you're somehow engaging. And I want you to talk a little bit about the strategies of the need to pass explicitly or the desire to sort of be this in-between subject in terms of those personas. And then for others to think about how you have to take on these roles as interlocutor and so forth in the projects that you engage. So if we could.
For us, it turns out to be really simple. We were chatting earlier outside about framing and how, as long as the audience thinks that it's the WTO speaking or Exxon, there's no problem. You can pretty much do anything you want, and at least I think so. I mean, we've done so many crazy things on stage to people who think that we are who we are. I think if we got up there and stumbled and if I didn't know what I was saying and my hair was a mess, I don't think it would make a difference. But it just kind of, it seems just natural to try to act like one of those people. No names. Yeah, but I mean, maybe being a spokesperson on TV is a different matter. Maybe then it's more important, but I don't know. Yeah, it's all about framing.
I mean, I agree with something of that, and that simply by donning a lab coat, you become this kind of professional. I think the fact that I have a British accent somehow saves my bad hairdo, and. So there's certainly something within the fact that I talk with my students about that here, about, if you can't be the person you want to be, can you get someone else to do it? And so you are working with what material you have. I know the fact that I'm like short and speak fast and have this kind of intensity definitely adds to it. I guess in terms of the persona, I found that really hard. In fact, when we first started when we first kind of began in England, and some parts of the ways I would be handing out, I would want to say it's an art project. And in fact, we were having it web streamed back to the Awareness Center for the Arts in San Francisco, and the woman who was doing the tech thing there was emailing, "Stop saying it's an art project," and which I was supposed to not say, but I couldn't handle it. At some point, being dismissed and ignored on the street with handing things out or trying to talk to people, and constantly being either ignored or else humiliated. I think the worst for me, probably because I'm from England, and I won't take up too long with this, but was a businessman on the street of the financial district who was completely ridiculing me, because we were saying straight from the States, this is made specifically for the European market, and handing out sort of suitcase of these objects and talking about them, and he was just completely making fun of me, and I found that really difficult because personally I wanted to go, but wait, I'm part of you, I agree with you, and he was completely kind of taking me dead on seriously and humiliating me. So the persona, then you have to kind of live within it. And then also there were high school kids who I was sure were going to beat me up. But that was my own kind of personal high school experiences coming back from
One experience that we had working with this project that sort of threw me for a loop was the fact that I had a subject that was somewhat savvy about their personality. Usually, I guess it's my being naive, but going into a community, you think you're talking to these people who have never been spoken to before, and you're going to sort of open up and get some sort of truth. And in this case, some of the kids had been in bands, and their homeless status sort of gave them a sort of street credibility. And then there had been a documentary that had been made about homeless youth in Seattle, maybe 5 or 6 years prior to us arriving. So I would sit down in the interviewing room with them, and they would immediately say, so you want me to tell you about like what heroin is like, right? And you want me to tell you how I give blowjobs for drugs, right? And you want me, like what sex is like on the street, right? And so it took me a while, me and Brad, a while to get to the point where to wipe away that and ask questions that were really more general and more about what is your notion of home? Tell me about the day. What was the day like that you decided that you were not going to return to your home, or you were going to leave your family members? I mean some of those interviews wound up being about over an hour, in some cases 2 hours, just to sort of sift through and move through what the perceived idea of what I wanted was.
And I guess the Witness Project was maybe the third or fourth large project that we did that involves testimonial, and sort of coming out of endurance, rather, we sort of decided to turn the lens of the camera on ourselves. And so it's really hard. It's really hard to be in the middle of, to be front and center. So in a way, we thought it would be a lot simpler because we don't have to negotiate through so many different organizations and people. But I'm not sure if that quite falls in line with your question, but in any case. Yeah. But it's very much a step away from the sort of ethical web of working with other people's stories in that sense.
Yeah, and I did think it was going to be a lot easier after working with 26 homeless youth and trying to iron out the logistics of everybody showing up at one spot at one time and, acting out this performance. At the end, I was like, okay, that's it. We generally talk about class and we talk about race, and between the two of us, we got race, and I think we got a little bit of class. Let's do it ourselves, and let's look at ourselves in some way. And thinking that it was going to be a little bit easier, and as Brad said before, it was a lot more difficult, and just as much of a logistical nightmare to try to make things happen.
Well, I'm tempted to say that I've been humiliated and ridiculed before, and I think that that's probably true, but basically, perhaps in difference with my colleagues here, personas aren't so useful for me. I actually just what you see is what you get, and the work is very sincere and actually atypical of the projects that we looked at briefly earlier.